Class 8th, Chapter 1. What is democracy? Why democracy? I'm just starting with the main content. A simple definition. Let us get back to our discussion on similarities and differences among government that are called democracies. One simple factor common to all democracies is the government is chosen by people. We could thus start with a simple definition. Democracy is a form of government in which the rulers are elected by the people. This is a useful starting point. This definition allows us to separate democracy from the forms of government that are clearly not democratic. The army, the army rulers of Myanmar were not elected by the people. Those who happened to be in control of army became the rulers of the country. People had no say in this decision. Dictators like Pinochet, Chile, are not elected by the people. This also applies to monarchies. The kings of Saudi Arabia rule not because the people have chosen them to do so, but because they happen to be born into a royal family. This simple definition is not adequate. It reminds us that the democracy is people's rule. But if we use this definition in an unthinking manner, we would end up calling almost every government that holds an election a democracy. This would be very misleading. As we shall find in chapter 3, every government in contemporary world wants to be called democracy, even if it is not so. That is why we need to carefully distinguish between government that is democracy and one that pretend to be one. We can do so by understanding each word in this definition carefully and spelling out the features of the democratic government. So here are some definitions. The first one is democracy gives every man the rights to be his own oppressor. Second one, democracy consists of choosing your dictator after they have told you what you think it is you want to hear. So what we want to hear, that person would be dictator and dictating accordingly. And we choose such a dictator who is saying whatever we want to hear. Third, man's capacity for the justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination towards injustice makes democracy necessary. Fourth one, democracy is a device that ensures we shall be governed no better than we deserve. Fifth one, all the ills of democracy can be cured by more democracy. There are some features listed here. Feature of democracy, would we have to state with a simple definition that democracy is a form of government in which the rulers are elected by the people. This raises many questions. Who are the rulers in this definition? Which officials must be elected for any government to be called a democracy? Which decisions may be taken by non elected officials in the democracy? What kind of election constitutes a democratic election? What conditions must be fulfilled for an election to be considered democratic? What are the people who can elect the rulers or get elected as rulers? Should this include every citizen on an equal basis? Can a democracy deny some citizens this right? Finally, what kind of a form of government is democracy? Can elect rulers do whatever they want in democracy, or must a democratic government function with some limits? It is necessary for a democracy to respect some rights of citizens. Let us consider each of these questions with the help of some examples. So, this is the interesting part of the chapter. Major decisions by elected leaders. In Pakistan, General Pervez Musharraf led a military coup in October 1999. He overthrew a democratically elected government and declared himself the chief executive of the country. Later, he changed his designation to president in the year 2002, held a referendum in the country that granted him a 5-year extension. Pakistani media, human rights organizations, and democratic activists said that the memorandum was based on based on malpractices and fraud. In August 2002, he issued a legal framework order that amended the constitution of Pakistan. According to this order, the president can dismiss the national and provincial assemblies. The work of the civilian cabinet is supervised by National Security Council, which is dominated by military officers. After passing this law, elections were held to the national and provincial assemblies. So Pakistan has had elections, elected representatives have some powers, but the final power rested with military officials and the General Pervez Musharraf himself. Clearly, there are many reasons why Pakistan under General Pervez Musharraf should not be called a democracy, but let us focus on the one of these. Can we say that the rulers are elected by the people in the Pakistan? Not quite. People may have elected their representative to the People may have elected their representative to the national and provincial assemblies, but those elected representatives were not really the rulers. They cannot take the final decision. The power to take final decision rested with army officials and the General Pervez Musharraf, and none of them were elected by the people. This happened in many dictatorships and monarchies. They formally have an elected parliament and government, but the real power is with those who are not elected. In a few countries, the real power was with some external powers and not with locally elected representatives. This cannot be called people's rule. This gives us the first feature in a democracy. The final decision making power must rest with those elected by the people. Free and fair electoral competition. In China, elections are regularly held after every 5 years for electing the country's parliament, called Kyungo Ramni Daptao, whatever it is. Okay, National People's Congress. The National People's Congress has the power to appoint the president of the country. It has nearly 3,000 members elected from all over the China. Some members are elected by the army before contesting elections. A candidate needs the approval of these Chinese communist parties. Only those who are the member of the Chinese Communist Party or the eight smaller parties allied to it were allowed to contest election held in 2002-2003. The government is always formed by Communist Party since its independence in 1930. Mexico holds election after every 6 years to elect its president. The country has never been under a military or dictator's rule, but until 2000, every election was won by a party called PRI, Institutional Revolutionary Party. Opposition parties did contest elections but never managed to win. The PRI was known to use many dirty tricks to win elections. All those who were employed in government offices had to attend its party meetings. Teachers of government schools used to force parents to vote for PRI. Media largely ignored the activities of the opposition political parties except to criticize them. Sometimes the polling booths were shifted from one place to another in the last minute, which made it difficult for people to cast their votes. The PRS spent a large sum of money in the campaign for its candidates. Should we consider the elections described above as example of people electing their rulers? Reading these examples, we get a sense that we cannot. These are the some common examples. There are many problems here in China. The elections do not offer the people any serious choice. They have to choose the ruling party and the candidates approved by it. Can we call this a choice? In the Mexican example, people seem to really have a choice, but in practice they have no choice. There was no way ruling party could be defeated even if people were against it. There are no fair elections. We can thus add a second feature to our understanding of democracy. Holding elections of any kind is not sufficient. The elections must offer a real choice between political alternatives, and it should be possible for people to use the choice to remove the existing rulers if they wish so. So the democracy must be based on the free and fair election where those currently in a power have a fair chance of losing. We shall find out more about a democratic election in chapter 3. One person, one vote, and one value. Earlier, we read about how the struggle for democracy we linked to the demand of universal adult franchisee. This principle has now become to be accepted amongst all over the world. So the universal adult franchisee is the right to vote after the age of 18. So it doesn't bar whether you're a girl, boy, or an older person, employed, unemployed. Once you're over 18 and you're an adult, no gender, no caste, nothing is taken into consideration. You can vote. So this is what universal adult franchisee is. Yet there are many instances of denial of equal rights to vote. Until 2015, a Saudi Arabia woman did not have the right to vote. Estonia has made the citizenship rule in such a way that the people belong to Russian minority find it difficult to get right to vote. In Fiji, the electoral system in Fiji the electoral system is such that the vote of an indigenous Fiji has more value than the one of an Indian Fijian. So in Mount Fiji, most of the people are Indian, because in the rule of British, most of the people were taken to Fiji for different type of jails and all. So most of the population is Fiji. In Fiji is Indian. Democracy is based on a fundamental principle of political equality that gives us the third feature of the democracy. In a democracy, each adult citizen must have one vote and each vote must have one value. We shall read about this in more chapter 3. So everything is going to be in chapter 3. I don't know why chapter 1 has been introduced. Rule of law and respect for rights. Zimbabwe attained independence from white minorities rule in 1980. Since then, the country has been ruled by ZANU PF, the party that led the freedom struggle. Its leader, Robert Mugabe, ruled the country since independence. Elections were held regularly and always won by ZANU PF. President Mugabe was popular but also used unfair practices in elections. Over the years, his government changed the constitution several times to increase the powers of president and make him less accountable. Opposition party workers were harassed and their meeting disrupted. Public protesters and demonstrations against the government were declared illegal. There was a law that limited the right to criticize the president. Television and radio were controlled by the government and gave only the ruling party's vision. There were independent newspapers, but the journalists who went against the government was harassed. The the government ignored some court judgments that went against it and pressurized judges. He were forced out of office in 2017. So he over here is written for the president Robert Mugabe. The example of Zimbabwe shows that the popular approval of the rulers is not necessary in a democracy, but it is not sufficient. Means the popular approval of the rulers is necessary in the democracy, but it is not sufficient. There has to be some moral rules as well. Popular government can be undemocratic, popular leaders can be autocratic. If we wish to assess a democracy, it is important to look at the elections, but it is equal equally important to look before and after the elections. There should be sufficient room for normal political activities, including political opposition. In the period before elections, this requires the state should represent some basic rights of citizenship. They should be free to think, to have options to express this in public, to form association, to protest and take other political actions. Everyone should be equal in the eyes of law. This these rights must be protected by an independent judiciary whose orders are obeyed by everyone. We shall read more about this in chapter 5. Similarly, there are some conditions that apply to the way of the government is run after the elections. A democratic government cannot do whatever it likes simply because it has won an election. It has to respect some basic rules. In particular, it has to respect some guarantees to the minorities. Every major decision has to go through a series of consultations. Every office bearer has every office bearer has certain rights and responsibilities assigned by the constitution and the law. Each of these is accountable not only for the people but also to other independent officials. We shall read more about it in chapter 4. Both these aspects give us the fourth and final feature of democracy, a democratic government ruled within limits set by constitutional law and citizens' rights.